In the dim corridors of history, there are doors deliberately sealed, their handles marked with the weight of silence. The Second World War, often remembered in speeches, textbooks, and films, holds far darker truths than those permitted for public memory. Behind the images of victory parades and liberation banners, there exist files once stamped with the words, "For eyes only," hidden away in locked vaults of Washington, Moscow, and London. These are not tales of battlefield heroics or political speeches. They are fragments of agreements, massacres, experiments, and stolen fortunes that defied justice, reshaped the post-war world, and cast long shadows into the Cold War. What you are about to hear are not myths, nor the echoes of conspiracy, but buried records and testimonies whispered between agents, defectors, and survivors who were never meant to be believed. They speak of pacts forged in ruins, of human lives reduced to experiments, of massacres erased for political convenience, and of fortunes spirited across borders to fund empires of secrecy. These truths, too dangerous to reveal in their time, are the dark residues of a war that never fully ended, files resurfacing from archives thought forgotten, demanding to be heard. Chapter 1. The Classified Pact Beneath Berlin's Ruins. In the final weeks of April 1945, Berlin was a city of collapsing stone, smoke-filled skies, and desperate whispers echoing through bombed-out streets. Soviet artillery thundered relentlessly from the east, while Allied bombers reduced entire neighborhoods to smoldering ash. Within the underground chambers of the Reich Chancellery, where concrete walls dripped with condensation and the smell of gunpowder lingered, desperate men convened. These were not the well-documented Nazi leaders whose names dominate the history books, but emissaries tasked with arranging what official records still deny: a secret pact between the remnants of the SS and Soviet intelligence, a negotiation made as the city crumbled above their heads. The documents, fragments now recovered from Moscow's Ministry of Security, carry the stamp Geheimstufe 4, a designation reserved for matters so sensitive they were to be destroyed once read. Yet somehow they survived. According to these fragments, beginning on April 22, 1945, just days before Hitler's suicide, meetings were initiated between select SS representatives and operatives of the NKVD. The Soviets had already infiltrated deep into Berlin, their Red Army divisions tightening a noose around the Reich's final defenses. The files indicate that SS officers, aware their regime was doomed, sought survival not only for themselves, but also for the vast intelligence networks painstakingly built across occupied Europe. These networks included informants embedded in resistance groups, agents within Allied territories, and access to industrial secrets stretching from Norway's heavy water facilities to France's occupied ports. For Stalin's representatives, the value of such an exchange was immeasurable. The war had cost the Soviet Union nearly 27 million lives. Information that could secure dominance in the post-war order was worth far more than the blood of the defeated enemy. The pact, as described, involved three components. First, a transfer of select Gestapo files, lists of operatives, informants, and hidden caches of weapons, to Soviet custody. Second, safe passage for specific SS and SD personnel, primarily those connected to rocket research and intelligence operations in Eastern Europe. Third, a guarantee that captured Nazi scientists would be granted conditional protection, provided their expertise was shared exclusively with Moscow and not surrendered to advancing American forces. Among the most disturbing elements is the suggestion that fragments of the V3 supergun project, an experimental artillery design capable of striking London from continental Europe, were among the assets traded. These documents align with post-war Soviet advancements in long-range artillery, developments historians have long attributed solely to indigenous design. The most chilling revelation, however, lies not in what was exchanged, but in who vanished. Declassified Soviet transport manifests reveal the sudden disappearance of at least 17 high-ranking SS figures from Berlin during the final week of April 1945. Their names do not appear on Allied prisoner lists. Their bodies were never recovered among the rubble. Instead, faint traces emerge in later Soviet records. Engineers resurfacing at research institutes in Moscow, intelligence specialists working quietly under new identities, doctors assisting with classified biowarfare projects. The evidence suggests that while some Nazis were put on trial at Nuremberg, others were quietly repurposed into Stalin's machinery. their pasts erased for the sake of Cold War advantage. American and British intelligence were not blind to these movements. OSS field reports from May 1945 contain urgent warnings of German technical personnel being evacuated into Soviet hands under undisclosed arrangements. Yet these warnings were downplayed or dismissed, likely because the Western allies themselves were already preparing operations like Paperclip, which would import Nazi scientists into the United States. In this light, the silence surrounding the Berlin Pact becomes less surprising. To acknowledge it would have been to admit that both East and West were complicit in shielding war criminals, valuing their expertise above justice. Testimonies from defectors decades later only deepen the unease. In 1963, an NKVD officer who fled to the West described the night meetings beneath Berlin, where the air stank of death and betrayal. He spoke of crates of documents hauled through tunnels, of SS officers boarding Soviet trucks with blank expressions, knowing their fates were sealed in a new kind of captivity. His account was dismissed at the time as Cold War exaggeration, yet when matched against the fragments now declassified, his words gain unsettling weight. The Pact's legacy lingered far beyond the ruins of Berlin. During the 1950s, Western intelligence noted unexplained advances in Soviet rocketry, particularly in the field of multi-stage propulsion. Analysts struggled to account for the sudden leap, given the USSR's earlier technological struggles. It is only with the resurfacing of the Geheimstufe 4 files that a plausible explanation emerges, that elements of Germany's unfinished research had been transferred eastward under the Pact. Similarly, the survival of Nazi intelligence networks, long suspected but rarely proven, finds new context in these documents. Some agents, once believed destroyed, appear to have shifted allegiance silently, feeding information to Moscow rather than vanishing in defeat. What is most disturbing is the deliberate suppression of this history. Allied archives contain gaps, files removed, testimonies sealed under national security orders, and references to sensitive Soviet cooperation excised from reports. The fragments that do survive bear signs of heavy redaction, pages blackened with ink, entire paragraphs cut away. Why? Because to admit the truth would have undermined the moral narrative of 1945, that the war ended with absolute justice, that evil was crushed entirely, that victors were free of compromise. Instead, the documents show a darker reality, one where power eclipsed morality, where survival dictated alliances, and where sworn enemies found common ground in secrecy. Walking through Berlin today, it is difficult to imagine the desperation of those final nights. Beneath the ruins, by the dim light of flickering lamps, men plotted not the defense of their nation, but the preservation of knowledge and influence. They bartered with their enemies, knowing that justice would never reach them if their expertise proved too valuable. The echoes of those agreements stretch into the Cold War, shaping missile programs, intelligence operations, and the very balance of global power. And though history prefers to remember victory parades and surrender ceremonies, these documents remind us of what was truly at stake in those final hours. Not merely the end of a war, but the silent beginning of another, born from a pact buried beneath Berlin's ruins. Chapter 2. Forbidden experiments of Unit 731 exposed. In the vast, frozen reaches of Manchuria, far from the European front lines, another war was being fought, one shielded by secrecy, denial, and the calculated destruction of evidence. Under the Japanese Imperial Army, a project bore the sterile designation Unit 731. Its full name, the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, gave no hint of the horrors within its walls. Established in 1936 under the command of General Shiro Ishii, this installation near Harbin was the epicenter of some of the most disturbing human experiments in history. The facility's outer appearance was unremarkable. Barracks, laboratories, and austere medical halls. Yet beyond the guarded gates, beneath the red-inked security seals, thousands of prisoners, Chinese civilians, Korean captives, Soviet POWs, and at times even Allied soldiers, were reduced to nothing more than maruta, or logs, test subjects for a regime obsessed with biological warfare. The experiments conducted were as clinical as they were cruel. Prisoners were exposed to plague-infested fleas released into controlled chambers, their bodies monitored to chart the disease's progress. Frostbite trials were carried out by forcing men and women into sub-zero conditions. their limbs submerged in ice until skin blackened and cracked. Vivisections were performed without anesthesia, organs dissected while subjects screamed, their pulses recorded until silence confirmed death. These were not aberrations of a few rogue doctors, but organized, methodical studies meticulously documented in ledgers and medical charts. Entire research units were assigned to weaponize pathogens, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, designed for aerial dispersal over civilian populations. Japan tested these methods not only in laboratories, but on unsuspecting villages across Manchuria, contaminating wells and releasing plague into fields, leaving entire communities to die unnoticed by the outside world. The war's end should have brought accountability. Instead, a far darker chapter unfolded. As Japan surrendered in August 1945, Soviet forces advanced into Manchuria and captured fragments of the Unit 731 complex. Laboratories were torched, records burned, and witnesses silenced. Yet the Soviets quickly grasped the value of what remained. In 1949, they staged the Khabarovsk war crimes trials, publicly exposing fragments of Unit 731's atrocities. Japanese officers confessed in detail to human experimentation, the mass release of plague, and the deaths of thousands. The evidence was overwhelming, but these trials were dismissed in the West as propaganda, their testimonies buried under Cold War distrust. What the Soviets revealed was horrifying, but what the Americans concealed was worse. Declassified US military archives confirm that American intelligence quickly seized surviving records and granted immunity to Ishii and his colleagues. The reasoning was blunt and chilling. The data from Unit 731's experiments was considered too valuable to destroy. At Fort Detrick in Maryland, home to the US Army's biological warfare program, Japanese doctors were quietly debriefed. In exchange for their freedom, they handed over detailed research logs, data gathered from live human subjects that could never be ethically reproduced. In 1947, internal memoranda marked top secret declared the information indispensable to national security, shielding perpetrators from trial at Nuremberg or Tokyo. Officially, Unit 731's crimes vanished from the record. Unofficially, their legacy became the foundation of Cold War bioweapons research. Among the files, one recurring name stands out: Project Maruta Data. These were thousands of pages of observations, meticulously organized into categories: frostbite thresholds, plague incubation timelines, aerosol dispersal patterns. The handwriting of Japanese doctors, once destined for courtroom evidence, instead became teaching material for American researchers. General Ishii himself was granted protection and lived out his days quietly in Japan, shielded from prosecution until his death in 1959. His associates, many of them decorated with academic titles, reintegrated into Japan's post-war medical establishment, their pasts scrubbed clean, their contributions reframed as epidemiological research. Some rose to prominence in hospitals and universities, lauded for their expertise while their victims remained nameless. Survivors' testimonies, smuggled out over decades, struggle against this wall of denial. Chinese witnesses described family members taken away by soldiers, never to return, their absence explained only by rumors of the death camp in Harbin. Former guards recounted how corpses were disposed of in furnaces, their ashes dumped into rivers. The odor of burned flesh, they said, lingered for miles. Soviet interrogations detailed doctors competing with one another, treating human lives as controlled variables in scientific contests. Yet for decades, Western textbooks made no mention of these crimes. The truth lay locked in US military vaults, classified under the justification of strategic necessity. The suppression had consequences far beyond history books. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, both the United States and the Soviet Union escalated their biological weapons programs, fueled in part by the human data extracted from Unit 731. Field tests of anthrax bombs in remote islands, simulations of pathogen dispersal in American cities, and secret laboratories mirrored the grotesque ambition of Ishii's unit. The victims of Harbin were thus doubly erased, denied justice in their time, and then used posthumously to fuel weapons stockpiles meant to threaten the world anew. What makes the legacy of Unit 731 most disturbing is the silence that still cloaks it. In Japan, official acknowledgement has been hesitant, often framed as vague war responsibility without specifics. Many records remain missing, presumed destroyed. Others, experts suspect, lie hidden in US archives yet to be declassified. Families of victims have petitioned for recognition, only to be told there is insufficient evidence. Their cries echo against governments unwilling to tarnish alliances or admit to compromises made in the name of security. Even now, disputes rage in international courts, where survivors demand the right to speak their truths against nations that would prefer silence. Unit 731 represents not only a crime of war, but a crime of memory. The experiments themselves were unspeakable, but the decision to bury the evidence made in Washington conference rooms, behind closed doors of intelligence committees, ensured that the atrocities' victims were denied even the dignity of acknowledgement. The shadows of Manchuria stretch long, reaching into the laboratories of the Cold War and even into the ethics debates of today. How much of modern biomedicine, critics ask, rests upon foundations stained with the suffering of those forgotten logs? The question is uncomfortable, but it refuses to disappear. Walking the ruins of Pingfang today, where parts of Unit 731's complex once stood, one encounters silence broken only by the wind across empty fields. The concrete shells of laboratories remain, stark and unadorned, reminders of a place where human life was reduced to variables in ledgers. No sound of confession fills the air. No courtroom ever echoed with full justice. Instead, the silence testifies to what was deliberately erased, leaving only fragments for historians, survivors, and truth seekers to piece together. In that silence lies the most damning truth of all, that the crimes of Unit 731 were not only committed but protected, preserved in secrecy, and fed into the very systems meant to guard civilization from inhumanity. Chapter 3. The Erased Massacre of Nemmersdorf. October 1944. The Eastern Front. The German village of Nemmersdorf, lying near the Angarap River in East Prussia, was the first German settlement to fall to advancing Soviet forces. Its streets were narrow, its houses wooden and modest, its church spire rising above autumn fields, heavy with the last harvest of a nation already broken by war. On October 21st, as elements of the Soviet 11th Guards Army crossed the bridge into Nemmersdorf, the population, primarily women, children, and the elderly, was left defenseless. What happened over the next hours became one of the most contested and suppressed atrocities of the war. A massacre whose details were known to Allied intelligence, but silenced in the name of wartime unity. German survivors and retreating Wehrmacht units described scenes of horror: women tied to barn doors and assaulted before being executed, children beaten to death in front of their parents, civilians shot where they stood as Soviet soldiers swept through the village. The accounts, initially gathered by the Wehrmacht propaganda department, were immediately dismissed in the West as exaggerations designed to bolster German morale. Photographs of mutilated bodies circulated in German newspapers, their authenticity questioned for decades. Yet documents locked in OSS and British archives tell a different story, one of knowledge deliberately suppressed, its truth inconvenient to the alliance with Stalin. Among the declassified fragments is an OSS report dated November 1944, marked restricted, not for release. It describes testimony from refugees who fled Nemmersdorf and neighboring villages, corroborating the brutality attributed to Soviet units. The report warns of potential morale consequences if details are made public in Allied press. Instead, it recommends silence, fearing that publicizing Red Army atrocities would undermine support for continued cooperation with the USSR. These documents remained buried for decades, their pages stamped with clearance levels, ensuring they would not resurface until long after the war ended. Soviet records, opened only after the fall of the USSR, reveal further evidence. Internal Red Army documents acknowledge disciplinary incidents in Nemmersdorf, though the language is clinical and deliberately vague. Orders were issued to silence soldiers who spoke openly about what they had seen or done. Survivors within the Soviet ranks who tried to report crimes were threatened with court-martial or disappearance. The massacre thus became an event spoken of only in whispers, brutality denied by the victors, preserved only in the fragmented memories of those who lived through it. The human toll is difficult to measure. Estimates vary wildly, with some German sources claiming hundreds killed, while later Western historians downplayed the figure to mere dozens. The truth lies somewhere between, obscured by propaganda and deliberate erasure. What is undeniable is that entire families vanished, their names appearing only in the refugee rolls that followed. Children who should have been in schoolrooms and mothers who should have tended to winter stores became statistics. their stories reduced to accusations dismissed as Nazi exaggeration. The refusal to acknowledge their deaths served a geopolitical purpose: to protect the fragile alliance with the Soviet Union and, after 1945, to stabilize NATO's relationship with Moscow. Eyewitness testimony provides chilling details that resist dismissal. One survivor, a woman named Margaret who escaped through the woods, described returning later with Wehrmacht soldiers to recover bodies. She spoke of women crucified against farm doors, of elderly men executed where they knelt, and of children's corpses tossed into ditches. Her testimony, recorded in refugee reports, was archived in Britain but locked under NATO sensitivity classification, ensuring it could not destabilize relations during the Cold War. Only decades later did fragments of her account surface, offering a glimpse into the silenced horror. What makes Nemmersdorf particularly haunting is not just the massacre itself, but the deliberate effort to erase it from memory. The narrative of the Great Patriotic War, carefully cultivated by Soviet propaganda, left no room for acknowledgement of Red Army crimes. In Western accounts, the Red Army was the liberator of Auschwitz, the force that broke the back of Hitler's war machine. To admit that these same soldiers committed atrocities against civilians in East Prussia was to fracture the moral clarity of the Allied victory. Thus, the story of Nemmersdorf was confined to the margins, dismissed as tainted by Nazi propaganda, even as fragments of truth remained hidden in classified archives. The Cold War deepened the silence. Western governments, focused on building NATO and preventing Soviet expansion, suppressed further investigation into Red Army crimes. Survivors were often dismissed as unreliable witnesses or accused of exaggeration for political purposes. Entire families displaced from East Prussia were resettled in West Germany, where their stories became private laments, passed down in hushed voices rather than public testimony. For them, justice was not only denied, but actively obstructed by governments unwilling to reopen old wounds. It was only in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that Russian archives yielded partial confirmation. Reports from the 11th Guards Army acknowledged civilian deaths in Nemmersdorf, but reframed them as unfortunate consequences of combat. The sanitized language contrasted sharply with the visceral accounts preserved by survivors. Yet even this limited admission was enough to reopen debates long dismissed. Historians now confront the reality that while propaganda certainly amplified aspects of the massacre, its core truth was undeniable. Civilians in Nemmersdorf suffered atrocities at the hands of the Red Army, and those atrocities were deliberately buried by all sides. Walking the fields of modern-day Mayakovskoye, the renamed village that once was Nemmersdorf, one finds little trace of the events of October 1944. Soviet reconstruction erased physical reminders, replacing destroyed homes with collective farm buildings and renaming streets to sever memory from place. The silence is almost complete, broken only by the testimonies preserved in refugee archives and the faint echoes of declassified reports. Yet beneath that silence lies a question as haunting as the massacre itself. How many other villages shared Nemmersdorf's fate, their stories erased for the sake of political convenience? The massacre of Nemmersdorf was more than a single event. It was a turning point, a moment when the cost of alliance outweighed the demands of justice, when memory was sacrificed for expediency. The civilians who died there became victims twice, first at the hands of soldiers and then at the hands of history itself, which refused to remember them. Their erasure reminds us that wars are not only fought on battlefields, but also in archives, where silence can kill truth as surely as bullets kill flesh. The massacre was not forgotten because it lacked evidence, but because its truth was too dangerous to acknowledge in a world already poised to divide along Cold War lines. And so Nemmersdorf remains a scar, visible to those who look closely, invisible in the grand narratives of victory and liberation. Chapter 4: Hidden Vaults of Operation Safehaven. In the final year of the Second World War, as the Allies closed in on Berlin and Hitler's empire collapsed, a parallel war was being fought, not with tanks or infantry, but with ledgers, gold bars, and coded transfers through shadowy financial networks. This clandestine campaign bore the codename Operation Safehaven. Its objective, at least officially, was to trace and recover Nazi wealth spirited abroad. Yet the documents that survive, many marked top secret, eyes only, reveal a far darker truth. Safehaven exposed financial trails that implicated not only fugitive Nazis, but also neutral states, powerful banks, and even institutions that would later anchor the post-war order. Much of what was uncovered never saw the light of day, deliberately buried to protect governments, corporations, and even the Vatican from scandal. From 1944 onward, Allied intelligence tracked the Reich's desperate efforts to preserve its stolen fortunes. As German cities burned and armies retreated, SS officials and industrialists were busy funneling assets across Europe. Gold looted from Jewish victims and occupied treasuries was melted down and stamped with neutral hallmarks in Swiss refineries. Masterpieces stolen from Parisian galleries vanished into private collections in Madrid. Industrial patents were transferred through shell companies in Buenos Aires and Santiago, ready to be reborn under false ownership in the Americas. Operation Safehaven was launched to intercept these flows, mobilizing the OSS, the US Treasury Department, and British intelligence. Teams combed through captured documents, interrogated bankers, and compiled exhaustive blacklists of firms suspected of laundering Nazi wealth. The scope was staggering. Hundreds of companies across Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, Turkey, and South America were implicated. Yet the deeper the Allies dug, the more dangerous their discoveries became. Recently declassified Treasury reports describe how Safehaven investigators traced gold shipments routed through Swiss banks, such as the Schweizerische Kreditanstalt and the Union Bank of Switzerland. These institutions, vital to Europe's post-war recovery, were found to have knowingly facilitated Nazi transactions. Rather than expose them, US officials quietly suppressed the findings. A 1946 memorandum warned that disclosure would destabilize critical financial institutions and compromise ongoing reconstruction. The evidence was sealed, ensuring that the same banks implicated in laundering Reich wealth would later become central pillars of the global economy. Equally unsettling were the Vatican connections. Under the protection of the so-called rat lines, SS officers and collaborators fleeing Europe used church-run charities as cover to reach South America. Documents from Operation Safehaven describe how gold and bearer bonds were funneled through Vatican accounts, shielded from scrutiny by diplomatic immunity. Argentine and Chilean shipping manifests confirmed that crates marked as ecclesiastical supplies contained far more than religious goods. Among the passengers on these voyages were men wanted for war crimes, traveling under Red Cross passports arranged through church networks. Though Safehaven investigators documented these routes, their reports were deemed too politically sensitive. The Vatican's role was never publicly addressed, its archives sealed beyond reach. The true fate of much of the Reich's fortune remains a mystery. Allied records estimate that billions in assets, gold, diamonds, art, and corporate shares vanished into Safehaven channels. Only a fraction was ever recovered. Some was used to bankroll fledgling industries in Franco's Spain. Some resurfaced in Argentine banks, quietly supporting Perón's regime. And some, most disturbingly, was recycled into Cold War intelligence operations. CIA memoranda from the early 1950s describe the recruitment of former SS bankers and industrialists, their knowledge of clandestine finance considered indispensable for covert funding. Men once accused of enabling genocide were thus repurposed as assets in a new geopolitical struggle, their pasts erased in the name of anti-communism. The moral compromises are laid bare in the blacked-out lines of declassified reports. Safehaven, conceived as a righteous effort to dismantle Nazi financial power, became instead a map of complicity. American and British officials understood the scale of collaboration. Neutral states profiting from stolen wealth, banks balancing their ledgers with blood-stained gold, and governments prepared to look the other way. But rather than confront these realities, they chose silence. The priority was stability, not justice. Exposing the full truth of Safehaven would have shattered faith in the very institutions tasked with rebuilding Europe. And so the evidence was buried, the vaults locked, the story left untold. The shadow of Operation Safehaven lingers even today. Investigations into Nazi-looted assets resurfaced in the 1990s, when class action lawsuits forced Swiss banks to compensate Holocaust survivors and their descendants. But these settlements, though historic, addressed only fragments of the hidden wealth. Vast sums remain unaccounted for, their trails lost in the labyrinth of shell corporations and numbered accounts. Artworks stolen in the 1940s still hang in private collections, their provenance scrubbed clean by decades of silence. Each missing painting, each vanished gold bar, is a ghost of Safehaven, a reminder of what was hidden not only by the defeated Nazis, but by the victors who chose to conceal the full extent of collaboration. Walking through the archives where the surviving Safehaven files now rest, one finds rows of boxes stamped with bureaucratic precision, their folders thick with financial tables, coded telegrams, and memoranda laced with frustration. Investigators knew the scale of what they uncovered. Some wrote bitter notes in margins, warning that history itself would be falsified if the files remained sealed. Their warnings proved prophetic. For decades, the story of the Reich's looted fortune was reduced to rumors of U-boats sinking with gold, or myths of hidden treasure in alpine caves. The reality was far less cinematic and far more damning. The gold was not lost, but laundered, not sunk, but circulated, not hidden, but repurposed under the watchful eyes of those who claim to fight for justice. Operation Safehaven was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of will, a conscious choice to protect institutions over truth, allies over accountability, and power over justice. The vaults were not empty, they were deliberately kept closed, and inside them lies the reminder that wars do not end when guns fall silent. They continue in the shadows of banks, archives, and secret agreements, shaping the world in ways the public was never meant to see. Safehaven promised to expose hidden fortunes, but in reality, it exposed something far more unsettling: the ease with which history itself can be bought, buried, and rewritten. The silence that blankets the hidden corners of World War II is not accidental. It was manufactured, engineered in conference rooms, military archives, and smoke-filled offices where men decided what humanity was allowed to remember. We have walked through 4 doors history tried to seal shut. A secret pact buried beneath the ruins of Berlin, grotesque experiments in the laboratories of Manchuria, the silenced massacre of a village in East Prussia, and the vaults of stolen fortune that fueled the shadows of the Cold War. Each revelation challenges the comfortable myth of clear-cut victory and untainted justice. Instead, we confront a truth far darker: that the end of the war was less a triumph of morality than a rearrangement of power, where justice was bartered, memories erased, and wealth repurposed for new battles. But the question lingers like smoke in an abandoned bunker. If so much was concealed, if archives were altered and evidence destroyed, then what else still lies hidden? What truths, still locked away in vaults or buried beneath classifications, continue to shape the world in silence? These are not just stories of the past. They are warnings that history is never complete, and that the darkest files may still remain unopened.